For decades, we were told to trust the food pyramid. It was plastered in classrooms, doctors' offices, and government pamphlets, sold as the blueprint for a healthy life. But what if this guide wasn't based on health at all? What if it was built on politics, profit, and powerful industry influence? This is the story of how the food pyramid may have done more harm than good, and why it's time to rethink everything we thought we knew about nutrition. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the US government began crafting official dietary guidelines that would eventually shape how an entire nation ate. At the center of this effort was nutrition expert Louise Light. Her team at the Department of Agriculture was tasked with creating evidence-based recommendations that would improve public health. Light's original guidelines emphasized whole, unprocessed foods, plenty of fruits and vegetables, moderate amounts of protein from quality sources, and natural fats, like those found in nuts, seeds, and fish. Her version warned against excess consumption of white bread, processed grains, and sugary foods. She even cautioned that flooding the diet with refined carbohydrates could lead to major health problems like obesity and diabetes. But when her report made it to the higher-ups, it was quietly rejected. The final guidelines looked nothing like what her team had submitted. Instead, a grain-heavy model was chosen. The new pyramid recommended 6 to 11 servings of bread, pasta, rice, and cereal every single day. Meanwhile, meats, eggs, and even some fruits were to be eaten sparingly. Natural fats were demonized altogether. Why the dramatic change? Because the food industry, especially grain producers and packaged food companies, had influence. Lobbyists for big agriculture were deeply embedded in the process. Recommendations that aligned with their bottom line got the green light. Those that didn't, scrapped. The science took a backseat. What mattered more was supporting U.S. grain production and keeping processed food companies profitable. The USDA had a dual mission: promote health, but also promote American agriculture. And when those goals conflicted, agriculture almost always won. This decision marked a turning point. The public didn't just get flawed advice, they got advice that had been rewritten under pressure. And the consequences of that rewrite were only beginning to show. When the official food pyramid was introduced in 1992, it wasn't just a suggestion, it was a mandate for how Americans were told to eat. At its foundation sat an enormous base of carbohydrates, 6 to 11 servings of pasta, cereal, and rice every single day. These weren't just optional. They were positioned as the cornerstone of a healthy diet. This grain-heavy focus shaped national food policy, school lunch programs, and household eating habits for years to come. Supermarkets filled their shelves with low-fat, high-carb foods. Breakfasts became bowls of sugary cereal, lunches, sandwiches, and chips. Dinner, more pasta, more bread. And all of it was doctor-approved, backed by a government-endorsed diagram hanging in kitchens and classrooms across the country. Meanwhile, foods that had nourished humans for generations, meat, eggs, natural fats, were pushed to the top of the pyramid with the cautionary label, "Use sparingly." Even fruits and vegetables were demoted to a secondary role, recommended in lower quantities than grains. But despite widespread adoption of this new way of eating, the results were disastrous. Obesity rates surged, type 2 diabetes cases climbed rapidly. Heart disease, the very condition the guidelines were supposed to prevent, remained the nation's leading killer. A bowl of sugar-loaded cereal and a serving of brown rice were treated as equals. White bread, crackers, breakfast bars, all marketed as healthy because they met the daily grain quota. Americans trusted the pyramid. They followed the rules. But instead of better health, they got chronic disease, and few ever questioned the source. But how did such a flawed model become national policy in the first place? How did the pyramid come to elevate processed carbs and demonize real, nutrient-dense foods? The answer lies in the influence of industry and the abandonment of sound science. As the guidelines were being shaped, powerful voices from the grain and processed food industries had a seat at the table. These companies stood to profit enormously if grains became the dietary default. And that's exactly what happened. To make room for this carb-heavy shift, the public was told to fear saturated fats, butter, red meat, and full-fat dairy were painted as the villains behind heart disease. But this narrative wasn't based on solid, conclusive science. The infamous diet heart hypothesis, popularized by researcher Ansel Keys, linked saturated fat to heart disease, but the evidence was far from airtight. Still, it was accepted without challenge. Meanwhile, industrial trans fats, used in margarine, baked goods, and fried foods, were marketed as the healthier alternative. Despite early red flags about their health risks, these artificially engineered fats were widely adopted and promoted. The result? Americans traded real food for low-fat, high-carb processed products, loaded with sugar, refined starches, and dangerous additives, and they did so under the illusion of eating healthy. But it wasn't just bad science, it was strategic. The pyramid structure opened the floodgates for a wave of processed food products that fit its guidelines perfectly. The food industry thrived, while public health unraveled. The rise of the food pyramid wasn't just about flawed science or industry lobbying, it was about building a system that rewarded massive agricultural output and funneled billions in government subsidies into the hands of a few powerful industries. As the pyramid took hold, government contracts and policy decisions began to align with its grain-heavy structure. Subsidies flowed heavily to producers of wheat, corn, soy, and dairy, making these ingredients incredibly cheap to grow, process, and sell. Meanwhile, small-scale farms that focused on vegetables, fruits, and pasture-raised meats were left out of the equation. And so, our food supply followed the money. Schools, prisons, hospitals, and food assistance programs began serving meals based on what was cheapest to supply, not what was healthiest to eat. Lunch trays were filled with white bread, pasta, sugary milk, and processed meat substitutes. Actual vegetables? Maybe a few canned green beans. Fresh food became an afterthought. Children were raised on foods designed not for nourishment, but for profit. The pyramid's influence extended far beyond households. It rewired the entire infrastructure of American eating, and it didn't stop at what we were served. It affected what farmers grew, how land was used, and what grocery stores put front and center. All of it shaped by policies that prioritized surplus grain over human health. The consequences were generational. By reinforcing this model through subsidies and institutional meals, the government didn't just recommend a diet, it enforced it. And in doing so, it ensured that the very industries profiting from our decline stayed in power. The system was now in full motion, government-backed, industry-driven, and deeply embedded into American life. But to truly understand how grains came to dominate our plates, we need to go back a bit further, to the 1970s, during a moment of global panic. At the time, the US was facing a grain crisis. A massive sale of American grain to the Soviet Union, negotiated in secrecy, had triggered food price inflation and domestic shortages. To stabilize the economy and take control of the food supply, the Nixon administration turned to a man named Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture. Butz had one mission: ramp up production at all costs. And he did just that. He deregulated farming, encouraged monocropping, and told American farmers to get big or get out. Thousands of small farms folded under pressure, while large-scale industrial operations expanded across the Midwest. Corn and wheat became the kings of agriculture, grown in endless fields year after year thanks to heavy government support. This overproduction created a new problem: surplus. The US had more grain than it knew what to do with. And so, rather than scaling back, the solution became marketing. The surplus had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was into our food. Grain wasn't just turned into bread and pasta anymore. It became the backbone of processed food. High fructose corn syrup, cereal fillers, cheap snack ingredients, and artificial meat substitutes. Everything from soda to frozen meals became vehicles for subsidized grains. And as the food industry scrambled to create new ways to sell this surplus, the government supported them, because doing so kept prices low, farmers afloat, and industry booming. The food pyramid, introduced years later, was perfectly timed to legitimize this system. It didn't just align with grain overproduction, it provided a moral framework for it. It told the public, this is healthy, this is what you should eat. And most people never realized the message was born out of economic crisis and political convenience, not nutritional truth. With surplus grains flooding the market and the food pyramid giving official approval, the final piece of the puzzle was narrative. To make grain-based products the default, something else had to take the blame for rising rates of heart disease and chronic illness. That something was fat. Specifically, saturated fat. Rather than questioning the explosion of processed carbs and synthetic ingredients, the government and food industry doubled down on the diet heart hypothesis. Popularized by researcher Ansel Keys, this theory claimed that saturated fat, found in meat, butter, eggs, and other traditional foods, was the primary cause of heart disease. But the science behind this claim was far from conclusive. Much of it was based on cherry-picked data and flawed epidemiological studies. Even within the scientific community, many researchers raised doubts, but their voices were drowned out by a growing alliance of policymakers, media, and food manufacturers who saw an opportunity. By demonizing fat, they gave the public a clear villain and a convenient excuse to avoid higher-quality, nutrient-dense foods in favor of cheaper, grain-based alternatives. The food industry ran with it. Low-fat became a marketing goldmine. Supermarket shelves were lined with fat-free cookies, yogurt, salad dressings, and snacks, all heavily processed and loaded with sugar, starch, and artificial additives to make up for the missing flavor. Products that once contained real food ingredients were re-engineered for shelf life and mass appeal, and the public, trusting the message, embraced the shift. Meat was cut from meals. Eggs were replaced with egg substitutes. Butter gave way to margarine and vegetable oil, all while refined carbs became the centerpiece of the average American diet. No one stopped to ask, if fat is the enemy, why are we getting sicker? The answer, as it turns out, was never fat. It was the engineered, grain-based food system that had quietly taken over, by design. By the early 2000s, the consequences of the food pyramid were no longer subtle. They were undeniable. Rates of obesity had tripled. Type 2 diabetes was no longer a disease of age, but one affecting children. Heart disease remained the leading cause of death, and metabolic disorders were becoming the norm, not the exception. The system was failing, but instead of admitting the error, policymakers changed the packaging. In 2011, the USDA unveiled MyPlate, a new visual model to replace the food pyramid. The pyramid was scrapped for a round dinner plate, split into colorful sections: fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, and dairy. It was pitched as simpler, more intuitive, and easier for families to follow. But in truth, MyPlate was little more than a rebranding of the same flawed message. Grains still occupied a massive portion of the plate, encouraging continued consumption of wheat, corn, and rice in various processed forms. Protein was now a vague category, deliberately lumping together meat, poultry, eggs, tofu, and legumes, softening the focus on animal-based nutrients. Saturated fats remained in the shadows, demonized by default, and seed oils, cheap, highly processed, and increasingly linked to inflammation, were never openly questioned. Behind the polished image was the same framework built in the 70s, one designed to move surplus grains, keep subsidies flowing, and protect the profits of industrial food producers. Meanwhile, foods with centuries of tradition behind them, like organ meats, bone broths, raw dairy, fermented vegetables, and pastured eggs, were quietly ignored or actively discouraged. These were the foods that nourished generations, yet they had no place in modern guidelines. In their place were fortified cereals, low-fat dairy products stripped of natural nutrients, and plant-based meat alternatives packed with additives, foods designed in labs, approved by policy, and backed by corporate-funded science. And the marketing was relentless. Whole grain labels on sugary cereals, heart-healthy stamps on vegetable oils, low-fat yogurts full of sugar, marketed as smart choices. The public was still being misled, only now with cleaner fonts, better PR, and a brighter plate graphic. MyPlate didn't fix the problem. It masked it. The pyramid may have been buried, but its core, the grain-heavy, fat-fearing, industry-driven agenda, remained untouched. The system simply updated its look while preserving everything that made it dangerous. As the decades rolled on, one truth became impossible to ignore. The institutions we trusted to protect our health were working hand in hand with the corporations that profited from our decline. Behind almost every major dietary recommendation, behind every food pyramid, plate, and policy, stood the fingerprints of industry. According to independent investigations, over 95% of experts involved in shaping national dietary guidelines had financial ties to major food companies like General Mills, Kellogg's, and Nestle. These companies fund research, sit on advisory panels, and sponsor health organizations. They shape the studies, steer the language, and silence dissent. The science the public sees is often filtered through layers of industry influence, polished and approved for maximum profitability. They've made ultra-processed breakfast cereals look like healthy food. They've sold sugar-packed snack bars as fuel. They've taken chemically refined oils and labeled them heart-healthy, and all the while, they've buried or ignored evidence that challenges their bottom line. But the story doesn't end there. As distrust in traditional food grows, a new frontier is emerging: lab-grown meat, plant-based substitutes, and engineered proteins, marketed as ethical, sustainable, and healthy. But beneath the surface, these products often rely on immortalized, precancerous cell lines, chemical additives, and industrial processing far removed from anything found in nature. We're being asked to trade real food, grown in soil, raised on pasture, rooted in ancestral wisdom, for ultra-processed lab experiments designed by billion-dollar biotech firms. It's not evolution, it's marketing. This is the next phase of control, and once again, it's being sold as progress. So where do we go from here? The answer is not in another government chart or industry-approved label. It's in returning to the basics: whole foods, local sources, healthy fats, unprocessed meats, seasonal produce, and ancestral eating habits that have stood the test of time. It's in rejecting the fear of natural fats, questioning processed health claims, and tuning out the noise of corporate nutrition. The food pyramid wasn't just a flawed guide. It was a blueprint for profit, disguised as public health. And until we acknowledge that truth, we'll stay trapped in a cycle of confusion, chronic illness, and corporate dependency. But the power to break that cycle is on our plates, 3 times a day.